The morning sky over Vareth Prime was painted in shades of purple and gold when the first ships appeared. Zekthar was drinking his morning tea on the balcony of the communications center, watching the sunrise over the agricultural fields that stretched beyond the city. He loved these quiet moments before his shift began, when the world felt peaceful and full of promise. The Vareth had built something beautiful here on this colony world, a home far from their crowded homeworld where families could grow and prosper. 300,000 souls lived here now, farming the rich soil and studying the unique ecosystem of this distant planet. The shadow fell across his face first. Zekthar looked up, his insect eyes adjusting to see the massive shape blocking out the sun. For a moment his mind could not process what he was seeing. Ships, dozens of them, descending from orbit like predatory birds. They were not Vareth ships. They were not any ships he recognized from the peaceful species of the Galactic Council. These vessels were dark, organic-looking things that seemed to pulse with an evil life of their own. His teacup fell from his hand and shattered on the floor. The alarms began screaming across the city. Zekthar ran inside the communications center, his heart pounding in his chest. The orbital defense stations were already gone, he could see that on the monitors. Just gone, wiped out in seconds by weapons that tore through metal like paper. His supervisor was shouting orders, but Zekthar could barely hear over the noise. The other communications officers were trying to contact anyone, the homeworld, the council, anyone who could help them. But they all knew the truth. Help was weeks away at best. The Vareth had no military. They were farmers and scientists, not warriors. They had nothing that could stop what was coming. The first orbital strikes hit the city within minutes. Explosions rocked the buildings and Zekthar was thrown to the floor. When he climbed back to his feet, half the screens were dead and smoke was pouring through the broken windows. He could hear screaming outside, the sound of people dying. The Catharn had come, that was what the old stories called them. The hunters from beyond known space. Everyone thought they were just myths, scary tales to frighten children. But they were real and they were here. Zekthar crawled to the emergency transmitter, the one they used for deep space communications. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely work the controls. He had to send a message. Someone had to know what was happening here. The building shook again and part of the ceiling collapsed near him, but he kept working. He typed out the coordinates, the situation, everything he could think of. 300,000 people dying. No defenses. Need immediate help. Please anyone help us. He broadcasted on every channel, every frequency the transmitter could reach. Maybe the council would hear it. Maybe someone would care enough to do something. The door behind him exploded inward and Zekthar turned to see the Catharn warriors entering. They were massive creatures, 8 feet tall with armored skin and eyes like burning coals. They moved like cats, graceful and deadly. One of them saw him at the transmitter and roared, raising a weapon that looked like it had been grown rather than built. Zekthar hit the final button. The message was sent. He closed his eyes and waited for death. The weapon fired and everything went black. The message traveled through space faster than light, bouncing from relay to relay. It reached the Galactic Council headquarters on Centris Prime within hours. A junior aide noticed it first, flagged it as urgent, and sent it up the chain of command. Emergency meetings were called. Representatives from dozens of species gathered to discuss the situation. The Vareth delegation was weeping, begging for help. Their people were being slaughtered and every minute wasted meant more death. But the council moved slowly. There were procedures to follow, protocols to observe. Some species questioned whether military intervention was appropriate. Others wondered if this was an internal Vareth matter. Ambassador Thelnara of the Pleiadian Concordat stood and spoke in her calm, measured voice about how violence only created more violence and how surely a diplomatic solution could be found. The debate continued while on Vareth Prime. Thousands died. The message also reached Earth. At Luna Station, the military headquarters of the Terran Coalition, a communications officer named Sarah picked up the distress call during her regular monitoring shift. She read it once, then read it again more slowly. 300,000 civilians under attack. No defenses. She had worked in military communications for 10 years, and she had never seen anything like this. The desperation in the message was clear even through the cold text on her screen. Sarah forwarded the message to her commanding officer immediately. Within the hour, it was on the desk of Admiral Kate Morrison. The Admiral was a short woman with gray hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. She had commanded ships in the Outer Colonies conflict, back when human pirates and separatists had threatened civilian settlements. She knew what it looked like when good people needed help and no one was coming. She read the distress call 3 times, then made a decision. She called an emergency briefing with her senior staff. Captain Jake Sullivan arrived first, a tall man in his mid-40s with the kind of face that looked like it had seen too much. He commanded the TCS Vengeance, one of the Coalition's heavy cruisers. He read the brief and his jaw tightened. Lieutenant Commander Maya Ortega came next, moving with the quick efficiency of someone who had spent years in ground combat before transferring to naval service. She scanned the information and swore under her breath. Sergeant Major Kyle Reeves was last, a massive man who seemed to fill the doorway. He was the senior Marine officer on Luna Station and had fought in more battles than most people could count. Admiral Morrison looked at each of them in turn and asked a simple question. Can we get there in time to matter? Captain Sullivan pulled up star charts and calculated jump coordinates. 5 days if they pushed the engines hard, maybe 6. Lieutenant Commander Ortega pointed out that every day they waited meant more people died. Sergeant Major Reeves said his Marines could be ready to deploy in 4 hours. The Admiral nodded slowly. She knew this would cause problems. The Galactic Council had not authorized any military action. Humanity was still new to the interstellar community, and many species already viewed them with suspicion. Earth was classified as a Class 12 death world, and humans were seen as dangerous because of where they came from. But the Admiral had not joined the military to follow rules while innocent people died. She looked at her officers and gave the order. Prepare the fleet. They were going to Verith Prime. Captain Sullivan returned to his ship and began issuing commands. The Vengeance and 3 destroyer escorts would make up the response force. They could have more ships in a week, but the Verith did not have a week. Lieutenant Commander Ortega coordinated with the tactical officers, planning approach vectors and combat scenarios. Sergeant Major Reeves assembled his Marines, a full battalion of 500 troops in powered armor with enough firepower to level a city doctor. Lisa Grant was pulled from her rotation at the Luna Station Hospital and assigned to the Vengeance as Chief Medical Officer. She was a trauma surgeon with steady hands and the ability to work under pressure that would break most people. She had volunteered for military service after seeing too many preventable deaths in civilian medicine. She packed her equipment and prepared for the worst. If combat was coming, there would be casualties, both human and alien. The fleet departed Luna Station 6 hours after the distress call arrived. The jump drive spun up, creating ripples in space-time that would carry the ships faster than light toward Verith Prime. Inside the Vengeance, Captain Sullivan stood on the bridge and watched the stars stretch into lines. He thought about the message from Zekthar, the desperate plea from someone who thought no one would answer. He thought about the Council and their debates and procedures while people burned. Humanity had not joined the galactic community to stand by and watch genocide. If that made them dangerous in the eyes of peaceful species, then so be it. On Verith Prime, the killing continued. The Catharn moved through the cities like shadows, hunting survivors with patient cruelty. They did not want a quick victory. They wanted sport. The Verith, who survived the initial attacks, hid in shelters and basements, listening to the sounds of destruction above them. Zekthar regained consciousness in the rubble of the communication center, his body broken but alive. He could hear the Catharn outside searching for more prey. He wondered if anyone had heard his message. He wondered if help was coming. He wondered if he would live long enough to find out. The answer was 5 days away and traveling at faster than light speed toward a battle that would change the galaxy forever. The Terran fleet dropped out of faster than light travel at the edge of the Verith system, and what they saw made Captain Sullivan grip the arms of his command chair. The orbital space around Verith Prime was a graveyard. Debris from destroyed defense satellites spun slowly through the void, catching the light of the system's sun. Catharn warships moved through the wreckage like sharks, 6 large cruisers and dozens of smaller raiders. On the planet below, cities burned. Even from this distance, the thermal signatures told a story of widespread destruction. Lieutenant Commander Maya Ortega ran the sensor data through the tactical computer and shook her head. The Catharn fleet was substantial, but their technology was strange. Their ships mixed biological and mechanical systems in ways that confused standard scanning. Energy readings fluctuated wildly, and their hull composition seemed to be partially alive. She had never seen anything like it, and that made her nervous. Unknown enemies were dangerous enemies. Captain Sullivan ordered a reconnaissance drone deployed. The small automated craft slipped through the debris field, using the wreckage as cover while its cameras captured images. The feed came back to the bridge and the crew watched in silence. The Verath cities were devastated. Buildings collapsed, streets torn apart, fires burning unchecked. But movement sensors detected life signs, thousands of them. Survivors were hiding in underground shelters and the Catharn were systematically hunting them down. Before Sullivan could give another order, alarms screamed across the bridge. 2 Catharn raiders had detected the reconnaissance drone and were accelerating toward the Terran fleet at impossible speeds. Their drives were pushing them faster than physics should allow, and Ortega realized their biomechanical systems did not care about the safety limits that protected normal ships. They would rather burn out their engines than let prey escape. Sullivan ordered defensive positions and the Terran destroyers moved to intercept. The first shots of the battle were fired 30 seconds later. The Catharn raiders opened up with plasma weapons that burned through space like liquid fire. The destroyer TCS Hammer took a hit on its forward shields, and the energy discharge lit up its hull. But the Terrans fired back with railguns, magnetic accelerators that launched projectiles at a fraction of light speed. The rounds hit the first raider and punched straight through its organic armor. The ship came apart in a spray of biological matter and metal fragments. The second raider tried to retreat, but the destroyer TCS Anvil was faster. It launched a spread of missiles that tracked the fleeing ship and detonated against its engines. The raider spun out of control, bleeding atmosphere and fluids from a dozen ruptures. It tried to turn back toward the planet, but its systems were failing. Eventually it just drifted, powerless and dying in the cold vacuum of space. Captain Sullivan watched the engagement end and made his assessment. The Catharn were aggressive and fast, but not invincible. Their ships relied on speed and overwhelming attacks rather than heavy armor. If the Terrans could force a direct fight, their superior firepower and coordination might be enough. He gave the order to advance toward the planet. The message was simple and clear. We are not here to talk. We are here to fight. The Catharn response was immediate and violent. Their 6 cruisers broke orbit and formed a defensive line between the Terrans and the planet. More raiders joined them until there were over 40 enemy ships facing the 4 human vessels. The odds were bad, but Sullivan had fought worse. He opened a channel to the entire fleet and spoke calmly. All ships, combat speed. Prepare to engage. Target their cruisers first, the raiders after. Stay in formation and watch your angles of fire. Good hunting. The battle began in earnest when the fleets closed to effective weapons range. The Vengeance led the charge, its heavy railguns firing in steady rhythms that shook the deck. Each shot carried enough kinetic energy to crack a planet, and when they hit Catharn ships, the results were devastating. Armor shattered, hull sections ripped away, and secondary explosions bloomed in the darkness. The destroyers spread out on the flanks, their lighter weapons targeting engines and weapon systems with surgical precision. The Catharn fought back with savage determination. Their plasma weapons scorched Terran shields and burned gouges in armor plating. They launched waves of small craft, piloted suicide drones that tried to crash into the human ships. Point defense systems shot most of them down, but a few got through. The Hammer took 3 hits on its port side and had to fall back with fires burning in 2 compartments. The crew fought to contain the damage while staying in the battle. Then the Catharn tried boarding. They launched pods from their cruisers, organic capsules that latched onto the Terran ships and burned through the hulls. Dozens of Catharn warriors poured into the corridors of the Vengeance, massive armored creatures with weapons that spat acid and fire. They expected to overwhelm the crew with shock and terror. They expected prey to scatter and die. They got Sergeant Major Kyle Reeves instead. He was leading a Marine fire team through the corridors when the first boarders broke through. The Catharn warrior that came through the breach was 8 feet tall and covered in natural armor plates. It roared and raised its weapon. Reeves put 3 rounds through its head from 15 feet away and it dropped like a stone. The Marines behind him opened fire in a coordinated volley that cut down the next 5 boarders before they even cleared the breach. The fighting moved through the ship section by section. The Catharn were strong and vicious, but the Marines fought with disciplined precision. They used cover, coordinated their fire, and fell back when necessary to draw the enemy into prepared kill zones. Reeves was everywhere, his voice calm over the tactical net as he directed his troops. Hold that corridor. Cover the left flank. Grenades on my mark. The Marines followed his orders without hesitation, because they knew he had kept them alive through worse situations. In one narrow corridor, a Catharn warrior got past the defensive line and charged straight at Reeves. The creature was wounded but still dangerous, its claws extended and its mouth open in a killing scream. Reeves dropped his rifle, pulled his sidearm, and fired 4 shots into its chest without flinching. The warrior crashed into him, and they both went down in a tangle of limbs. 2 Marines pulled the dead Catharn off their sergeant and helped him to his feet. Reeves checked his weapon, reloaded, and kept moving. No time to stop. More boarders were still coming. The boarding action lasted 40 minutes before the last Catharn warrior was killed. The Marines secured the breached sections and damage control teams moved in to seal the hulls. 32 Catharn bodies littered the corridors. The Marines had lost 8 dead and 16 wounded. Dr. Lisa Grant and her medical team worked frantically in the ship's sickbay, treating injuries that ranged from acid burns to massive trauma. She worked with quick efficiency, her hands steady even as the ship shook from weapons fire. She saved lives that should have been lost and never stopped moving from one patient to the next. Outside the ship, the space battle reached its peak. Lieutenant Commander Ortega identified a weakness in the Catharn flagship. Its biological systems required constant cooling from external reservoirs, and those reservoirs were vulnerable. She coordinated targeting data to all Terran ships, and they focused their fire on that one spot. Railgun rounds and missiles converged on the cooling system, and it ruptured in a cascade of failures. The flagship began to overheat, its biomechanical components cooking themselves from the inside. The ship broke apart in a series of explosions that sent debris spinning across the battlefield. The death of the flagship broke the Catharn formation. Their remaining cruisers began to retreat, pulling back toward the far side of the planet. The raiders scattered in all directions, fleeing into deep space. Captain Sullivan considered pursuit, but his ships were damaged and his crew was exhausted. More importantly, the mission was not to destroy the Catharn fleet. The mission was to save the Verath survivors. He ordered the fleet to hold position and secure orbit. The battle for Verath prime orbital space was over. The Terrans had won, but the cost was heavy. The hammer was barely functional and would need weeks of repairs. The Anvil had lost 30% of its crew to the fighting. The Vengeance itself was scarred and battered, with whole sections exposed to vacuum. But they held the high ground now, and the Catharn ships were retreating. Captain Sullivan opened a channel to the surface and broadcast a simple message in every language the Verath used. "This is Captain Jake Sullivan of the Terran Coalition. We received your distress call. We are here to help. Hold on. We are coming down." Sergeant Major Reeves assembled his Marines for the ground assault. They had lost people in the boarding action, but there were still over 400 combat-ready troops. They boarded the dropships in full battle gear, powered armor sealed and weapons loaded. The descent to the planet's surface would be dangerous. The Catharn still had ground forces down there and they would not give up easily. But the Marines had fought through hell already today and they were ready to do it again. The dropships launched from the Vengeance and dove toward the planet. Catharn anti-aircraft fire lit up the sky. One dropship took a direct hit and went down in flames. Its crew lost before they could even reach the ground. But the others made it through. The Marines moved through the ruined city in squad formations, their armor servos humming quietly in the smoke-filled air. Sergeant Major Reeves led from the front, his helmet display showing thermal signatures and motion tracking. Every few blocks they found more bodies, Verath civilians who had not made it to shelter. The sight made even hardened soldiers angry. These people had done nothing wrong. They were farmers and teachers and children. They did not deserve this. A scout team reported contact 3 blocks ahead. Catharn hunters were digging through rubble near what looked like a shelter entrance. Reeves signaled for a flanking maneuver and 2 squads moved silently through the ruins. The Catharn were focused on their prey and did not notice the humans until it was too late. The Marines opened fire from 2 directions simultaneously. The coordinated ambush cut down 6 Catharn warriors in under 10 seconds. The survivors tried to scatter but found themselves trapped in a kill zone. None of them escaped. Reeves approached the shelter entrance and pulled away the debris with his armor's powered assistance. The door below was sealed, but he could see movement through the gaps. He activated his suit's external speakers and spoke slowly. "We are human soldiers from Earth. We received your distress call. You are safe now." The door opened slowly and Verath faces peered out, insect eyes wide with fear and hope. There were nearly 200 survivors packed into the underground space, including children who clung to their parents. One of the Vareth stepped forward on shaking legs. He was injured. His exoskeleton cracked and his breathing labored. It was Zekthar, the communications officer who had sent the original distress call. He looked at the massive armored figure of Reeves, and his translator struggled with the words. "You came. Someone actually came." His voice broke, and he would have collapsed if a Marine medic had not caught him. The medic checked his injuries and called for Dr. Grant. Dr. Lisa Grant arrived with the second wave of dropships. She had set up a field hospital in a partially intact building and was already treating dozens of wounded Vareth. Her medical training was human-focused, but she adapted quickly, using downloaded xenobiology databases to understand Vareth physiology. Their biochemistry was different, but the basics of trauma care remained the same. Stop the bleeding, stabilize the patient, treat for shock. She moved from one patient to the next with calm efficiency, her hands steady even when the building shook from distant explosions. Zekthar was brought to her, and she examined his injuries carefully. He had 3 cracked sections of exoskeleton, internal bleeding, and severe dehydration. She started an IV of fluids, administered medication for the pain, and began cleaning the wounds. As she worked, he watched her with those large insect eyes and spoke through his translator. "I did not think anyone would come. The council always talks but never acts. Why did you come?" Grant did not look up from her work, but her voice was firm. "Because you asked for help, and it was the right thing to do." Over the next 3 days, the Terran Marines systematically cleared the city of Catharn forces. They moved sector by sector, using drones for reconnaissance and calling in precision orbital strikes on hardened positions. The Catharn had expected to hunt prey, but instead found themselves facing an enemy that hunted them back. The humans did not panic. They did not scatter. They adapted to every Catharn tactic and countered with ruthless efficiency. The Catharn began to experience something their species had never known: fear. They were the apex predators. They were the hunters, but these Deathworlders from Earth were better at it. The humans set traps using explosives and lured Catharn warriors into kill zones. They used thermal imaging to track Catharn through walls and eliminated them before they even knew they were under attack. They captured wounded Catharn and interrogated them, learning about command structures and reinforcement schedules. Within days, the hunters had become the hunted. One Catharn commander named Krasharn refused to accept this reversal of the natural order. He was an alpha predator, bred and trained for dominance. The idea that prey could fight back was offensive to everything he believed. He gathered every warrior he could find, over 300 elite fighters, and planned a final assault on the human position. He would crush these upstart Deathworlders and remind them of their place in the food chain. The attack came at dawn. Catharn shock troops charged across open ground, supported by biomechanical war machines that spewed acid and plasma. The Marines were ready behind hastily constructed fortifications made from rubble and their own deployable barriers. Heavy weapons teams opened fire immediately. Railguns and missile launchers cut through the first wave like wheat, but the Catharn kept coming, driven forward by Krasharn's fury and the belief that overwhelming force would break the human line. Sergeant Major Reeves was in the center of the defensive position, his voice steady on the tactical network as he coordinated the response. "Hold your fire until they reach the markers. Heavy weapons focus on the war machines. Riflemen take the infantry. Nobody breaks. Nobody runs. We hold this line." The Marines followed his orders because they trusted him completely. He had earned that trust through years of combat where he always brought his people home. The Catharn war machines reached the defensive line, and combat became brutal. One machine broke through, and its acid spray melted the armor of 2 Marines before Reeves personally destroyed it with a rocket launcher. He dropped the empty launcher, grabbed his rifle, and kept fighting. A Catharn warrior leapt over the barricade and landed in the middle of the defensive position. 3 Marines engaged it in close combat, while Reeves directed fire to prevent more from following. The warrior killed 1 Marine before it was brought down by concentrated fire. Lieutenant Commander Maya Ortega watched the battle from orbit through satellite feeds. She saw the Catharn rear formations preparing to reinforce the attack and made a quick decision. She coordinated with the other ships and called in an orbital strike. The railguns fired from space, and their rounds hit the Catharn reinforcements like the hand of an angry god. The impacts created craters where formations had stood moments before. The Catharn advance faltered as their rear support simply ceased to exist. Krasharn saw his attack collapsing and roared his frustration. He led a personal charge toward the human position, his massive form covered in ceremonial armor. He got within 100 meters before a Marine sniper named Danny put a railgun round through his skull from a kilometer away. The Catharn commander dropped mid-stride and did not move again. With their leader dead and their reinforcements destroyed, the remaining Catharn broke. They retreated into the wilderness in scattered groups, no longer a cohesive fighting force. The battle was over. The Marines secured the area and began the grim work of casualty assessment. 37 human soldiers had died in the defense. Another 74 were wounded, some critically. Dr. Grant and her medical teams worked for 18 straight hours treating the injured. She saved most of them through skill and sheer determination. She barely slept for 3 days and never complained once about the workload. The Verith survivors emerged from their shelters cautiously at first, then in growing numbers as they realized the danger had passed. They found the human soldiers exhausted and bloodied but still standing. The contrast was stark. These Deathworlders could have just destroyed the Catharn from orbit and left. Instead, they came down to the surface, fought building by building, and protected the Verith survivors even at the cost of their own lives. The Verith had feared humans as violent predators. Now they saw them as something else. Protectors. Zekthar, recovered enough to walk with assistance, visited the human encampment. He found Captain Sullivan coordinating relief efforts and waited patiently to speak. When the captain finally had a moment, Zekthar approached and his translator worked overtime to convey his gratitude. "You saved us. Your people died to protect mine. I will never forget this. I will make sure my people never forget this." Sullivan, dirty and tired and mourning his lost crew, simply nodded. "No one should have to face that alone. That is why we came." Intelligence teams examined captured Catharn data and made a disturbing discovery. The attack on Verith Prime was not isolated. The Catharn had been raiding the edge of known space for decades. They had destroyed at least 12 colony worlds that anyone knew about. The Galactic Council had dismissed reports of these attacks as accidents or misunderstandings. They had not wanted to believe that such savagery still existed in the modern galaxy. That willful blindness had cost countless lives. Captain Sullivan transmitted all the evidence to Terran Command and the Galactic Council. The data was clear and damning. The Catharn were an existential threat to peaceful species, and they would not stop unless someone stopped them. The question was whether the galaxy had the will to act, or if they would continue to hide behind debates and protocols, while more innocents died. Sullivan suspected he already knew the answer. Some of the Council would demand action. Most would call for more study. And in the end, it would probably be humans and their allies who did the actual fighting. But not all species were paralyzed by fear or ideology. The Verith pledged their full support to humanity, offering their industrial capacity and resources. Other species, impressed by the Terran victory, sent to Bar. News of the Terran intervention at Verith Prime spread through the Galactic Council like wildfire. The debate over humanity's actions dominated every session. Some species called them heroes, while others condemned them as dangerous warmongers who had violated every principle the Council stood for. Ambassador Thelnar of the Pleiadian Concordat led the opposition with passionate speeches about how military force was never the answer and how the humans had set a terrible precedent that would destroy the foundations of galactic peace. The human ambassador, Richard Cross, defended his species with equal passion. He presented evidence of Catharn atrocities to the Council chambers. Images of destroyed colonies, records of species wiped from existence, data showing that the Catharn had been killing for decades while the Council debated and issued statements. He looked at the assembled representatives and asked them a simple question. How many more must die before you admit that some threats cannot be reasoned with? The chamber fell silent because nobody had a good answer. The Verith representative Elder Mirkesh spoke through tears. Her people owed their lives to humanity. While the Council had debated, humans had acted. While others talked about peace, humans had brought salvation. She demanded that the Council recognize the reality that their pacifist philosophy had allowed genocide to continue unchecked. Her words created cracks in the unity that the Council had maintained for millennia. Some species began to question whether their ideals were truly moral when they permitted innocents to die. But the political fallout was meaningless to the Catharn. News of their defeat reached the Catharn homeworld, and the ruling caste convened to discuss this unprecedented situation. For a species that had never known defeat, the loss was incomprehensible. These humans were not like the prey species they had hunted for generations. They were predators, evolved on a world that had forged them through competition and violence. The Catharn recognized this threat and responded in the only way their culture understood: total war. The Catharn declared a blood hunt against humanity. They mobilized their fleets and prepared to exterminate every human in the galaxy. This declaration terrified many council species who understood that if the Catharn focused their full might against the humans, even the Deathworlders might be overwhelmed. Some quietly hoped that humanity would back down and withdraw, allowing the situation to de-escalate. They did not understand human stubbornness or the simple fact that humans do not abandon those who need them. The Terran coalition did not back down. Admiral Kate Morrison authorized the mobilization of every available ship. Shipyards across human space worked around the clock, constructing new warships and retrofitting civilian vessels with weapons. The Sol system became a fortress with defense platforms and orbital guns covering every approach. Mars dedicated its entire industrial capacity to war production. The asteroid belt mining operations switched to military logistics. Earth itself prepared for the possibility of invasion. But Admiral Morrison and her staff knew that humanity could not win this war alone. The Catharn had been expanding for centuries and their empire was vast. Ambassador Cross worked tirelessly to build a coalition of willing species. The Verath joined immediately, offering everything they had. The Draknari committed their warriors and fleet with enthusiasm. A dozen smaller species, emboldened by the human example and terrified of Catharn expansion, pledged their support. The coalition called itself the Free Species Alliance and established joint command structures. Captain Jake Sullivan was promoted to admiral and given command of the Alliance fleet. His tactical brilliance and the fact that he was the hero of Verath Prime made him the ideal choice. He accepted the responsibility with the same quiet determination he brought to everything. He knew the weight of command. He knew that his decisions would determine who lived and who died. He had carried that burden before and would carry it again. The Catharn struck first. A massive fleet emerged from dark space near the human colony of New Vancouver. 3 million civilians lived there and the colony was defended by only a modest garrison. The Catharn expected an easy victory and planned to broadcast the destruction as a warning to the rest of humanity. But Admiral Sullivan had anticipated their strategy. He had positioned a significant portion of the Alliance fleet in the sector, hidden in the shadow of a gas giant where sensors could not detect them. When the Catharn emerged and began their attack run on New Vancouver, the Alliance fleet hit them from the side. Hundreds of ships poured out of hiding and engaged at close range. The Catharn had been expecting prey. They found an ambush instead. The Battle of New Vancouver lasted 14 hours and became the first major fleet engagement of the war. The void filled with fire and death as ships from dozens of species fought side by side. Terran heavy cruisers anchored the battle line, their railguns hammering Catharn vessels at extreme range. Draknari frigates darted through the chaos like predatory fish, targeting engines and weapons with precision strikes. Verath support ships coordinated fleet movements and kept supply lines open. The Catharn fought with savage determination but found themselves facing coordinated tactics they had never encountered. Every time they adapted to one threat, another struck from a different angle. Admiral Sullivan commanded from the bridge of his flagship, the TCS Defender. He watched the battle unfold across multiple displays and adjusted his strategy in real time. When the Catharn tried to break through the center, he reinforced it with reserve squadrons. When they attempted a flanking maneuver, he had anticipated it and deployed interceptors. His staff officers marveled at how he seemed to know what the enemy would do before they did it. He simply understood the logic of combat and could read the flow of battle like others read books. The turning point came when a Catharn battle carrier attempted to deploy fighters directly above New Vancouver. If those fighters reached the planet, millions would die. Admiral Sullivan made a difficult choice. He ordered 3 destroyers to ram the carrier, sacrificing them to protect the colony. The destroyer captains acknowledged the order without hesitation and drove their ship straight into the Catharn vessel. The combined impact and resulting explosion destroyed the carrier and every fighter it carried. It also killed 900 Alliance crew members who had followed orders knowing they would not survive. That sacrifice broke the Catharn assault. Their fleet was already battered, and the loss of the carrier shattered their formation. The remaining Catharn ships began to retreat in disorder. Alliance forces pursued and destroyed stragglers until Admiral Sullivan called off the chase. New Vancouver was saved, but the cost had been terrible. Nearly half the Catharn fleet was destroyed, but the Alliance had lost 30 ships and 15,000 personnel. Admiral Sullivan wrote personal letters to the families of every crew member who died under his command. It took him 3 weeks, and he never slept more than 4 hours a night while doing it. The victory at New Vancouver sent shockwaves through the galaxy. For the first time, species began to believe that the Catharn could be defeated. More civilizations joined the Alliance, bringing ships and resources and personnel. The coalition grew from a handful of desperate species to a true interstellar power. But the war was far from over. The Catharn regrouped and adapted their tactics. They began using biological weapons against undefended colonies. They infiltrated Alliance logistics and sabotaged supply lines. The conflict spread across dozens of star systems. The Galactic Council became increasingly irrelevant as the war escalated. Real decisions were made by the Alliance, while the Council issued hollow statements calling for peace that neither side heeded. Some Council species began to wonder if the institution that had governed the galaxy for thousands of years had outlived its purpose. The universe was changing, and those who could not change with it would be left behind. The age of peaceful debate was ending, and the age of necessary violence had begun. Sergeant Major Kyle Reeves spent the months after Vareth Prime training new Marines. The Alliance needed soldiers, and humans were the best at producing them. He drilled recruits until they could fight in their sleep. He taught them tactics and strategy, and the cold mathematics of survival. He was harsh but fair, and every Marine who graduated his program was ready for combat. Many of them would die in the fighting to come. Reeves knew this, and it haunted him, but he also knew that proper training gave them the best chance of coming home. Dr. Lisa Grant established trauma centers across Alliance space. She recognized that the war was creating psychological wounds as deep as physical ones. She trained other doctors in treating combat stress and survivor guilt. She worked with Vareth healers to develop cross-species psychological care. She never stopped believing that healing was possible even in the midst of violence. Some called her naive, but those who worked with her knew better. She understood that war broke people, and that someone had to put them back together. Lieutenant Commander Maya Ortega took command of the Vengeance after it was repaired and upgraded. She led aggressive patrols along the border, intercepting Catharn raiders before they could reach civilian targets. Her reputation for aggressive tactics earned her the nickname Iron Maya. Among both allies and enemies, she pushed her crew hard, but they followed her because The Alliance fleet gathered at the edge of Catharn space, thousands of ships from dozens of worlds united by necessity and blood. Admiral Jake Sullivan stood on the bridge of his flagship and looked at the tactical display showing the largest military force ever assembled in known history. Every species that had suffered under Catharn raids was here. Every world that feared becoming the next Vareth Prime had sent what they could. The display showed Terran cruisers, Draknari destroyers, Vareth support vessels, and hundreds of smaller craft. It was magnificent and terrible at the same time. The target was Cathara, the Catharn homeworld. It was surrounded by orbital fortresses and defended by what remained of their fleet. Intelligence estimated at least 400 warships plus countless defense platforms. The numbers were daunting, but Sullivan knew there was no other choice. If they did not end this now, the war would drag on for decades and cost billions more lives. He opened a fleet-wide channel and spoke in the calm voice that had steadied so many in crisis. "All ships, this is Admiral Sullivan. We have come a long way together. We have lost friends and family. We have seen horrors that will haunt us forever, but we are still here, still standing, still fighting. Today we end this war. Today we show the galaxy that predators can be defeated. All ships execute Attack Plan Alpha, and may whatever gods you believe in watch over us all." The fleet jumped into Catharn space and emerged in perfect formation. The Catharn had known they were coming, but the sheer scale of the Alliance force shocked them. They had expected a large attack. They had not expected an armada that blotted out the stars. The Catharn fleet moved to engage immediately, driven by desperation and the knowledge that if they lost here, everything was lost. The final battle of the war began with a fury that would be remembered for generations. The Catharn defense was ferocious. Their orbital fortresses opened fire with weapons that tore through shields and armor. Their fleet threw itself at the Alliance with suicidal determination. Ships exploded in blooms of fire that briefly outshone the system's sun. The void became a graveyard as vessels from both sides were torn apart by weapons fire. Admiral Sullivan coordinated the assault with cold precision, moving forces like pieces on a board. When the Catharn reinforced their left flank, he hit them on the right. When they tried to concentrate fire, he dispersed his formation and attacked from multiple vectors. Lieutenant Commander Maya Ortega commanded a strike force of fast attack ships that slipped through the chaos to target the orbital fortresses. Her squadron took heavy casualties, but they accomplished their mission, destroying 3 fortresses and crippling 2 more. She watched good people die following her orders and felt each loss like a knife to the gut. But she kept giving orders because the mission had to succeed. When her flagship took critical damage, she transferred her flag to another ship and continued the attack without pause. The space battle raged for 2 days without pause. Crews fought in shifts, grabbing sleep when they could and returning to their posts exhausted. Medical bays overflowed with casualties. Dr. Lisa Grant worked aboard one of the fleet medical ships, treating injuries from every species in the Alliance. She had not slept in 40 hours, but her hands remained steady. She saved lives through skill and determination while the battle raged around her. She did not think about the larger war or the politics or the cost. She focused on the person in front of her and did everything possible to keep them alive. On the 3rd day, Admiral Sullivan ordered the ground assault to begin. The orbital defenses were weakened, and the Catharn fleet was breaking. It was time to finish this. Sergeant Major Kyle Reeves led the first wave down to the planet's surface at the head of 5,000 Marines from a dozen species. The descent was hell. Catharn anti-air fire destroyed dozens of dropships. Reeves watched ships full of soldiers explode and kept his voice steady on the command net. All units maintain formation. Stay focused. Remember your training. We are going to win this. The dropships that survived landed in the midst of Catharn military strongholds. The fighting was savage from the first moment. Catharn warriors defended their homeworld with fanatical intensity. They knew this was their last stand. The Marines pushed forward, building by building, street by street. Reeves was at the front of the advance, his armor scorched and dented but still functional. He had lost count of how many enemies he had killed. He had lost count of how many of his Marines had fallen. He just kept moving forward because stopping meant death. The objective was the Catharn Command Center, a massive fortress at the heart of their capital city. The Marines fought through 3 defensive lines to reach it. The casualties were horrific. Entire squads were wiped out. Reeves lost friends he had served with for 20 years. But they kept pushing because they had come too far and lost too much to stop now. The final assault on the command center lasted 6 hours. The Marines used everything they had: heavy weapons, explosives, and in some cases just their fists and determination. Reeves personally led the final breach. He and a dozen Marines fought their way to the command chamber where the Catharn ruling caste had gathered. The Catharn leaders stood ready to fight to the death, their weapons drawn and their eyes burning with hatred. Reeves raised his weapon and spoke through his armor's speakers. "You have lost. Your fleet is destroyed. Your defenses are broken. Surrender now and your species will survive. Fight and we will end you." The Catharn leaders looked at each other and then at the bloodied but unbroken human in front of them. They understood that these Deathworlders meant every word. One by one they laid down their weapons. The war was over. The news spread through the Alliance fleet and then across the galaxy. Humans wept with relief. Varath sang songs of victory. Draknari roared their triumph to the stars. But for those who had fought, the victory felt hollow. Too many had died. Too many worlds were broken. Admiral Sullivan sat in his ready room and wrote letters to families of the fallen, just as he had after every battle. He would write thousands before he was done. Lieutenant Commander Ortega stood on her damaged bridge and looked at the empty stations where crew members had once worked. Sergeant Major Reeves walked through the field hospital and saw the cost of victory in the faces of wounded Marines who would never be whole again. The Catharn were not exterminated. Despite calls for vengeance from some species, the Alliance chose a different path. The Catharn military was dismantled and their weapons destroyed. Their territory was placed under Alliance supervision. But they were allowed to survive as a species. Some Catharn resisted and were dealt with harshly. Others, particularly the younger generation, began to question the old ways. They had been taught that they were the ultimate predators. The war had proven that belief wrong. Now they had to find a new way to exist in a galaxy that would never fear them again. The Galactic Council collapsed under the weight of its own irrelevance. The Free Species Alliance became the dominant political force in the galaxy. It was more pragmatic than the old council, more willing to use force when necessary, but also more inclusive. The alliance drew strength from diversity, rather than trying to enforce uniformity. It was not perfect. There were still debates and disagreements and political maneuvering. But when threats emerged, the alliance could act rather than debate until it was too late. The Varath rebuilt their worlds with alliance support. Zekthar became a prominent diplomat, working to strengthen bonds between species. He never forgot the humans who answered when his people needed help. He spent the rest of his life making sure the galaxy remembered too. Monuments were erected on dozens of worlds honoring those who had fought and died in the war. The largest stood on Varath Prime, a statue of a human marine in armor holding a Varath child. The inscription was simple. They heard our call. They came, they fought. They saved us. Admiral Jake Sullivan retired after the war. He could not shake the ghosts of the thousands who had died under his command. He returned to Earth and bought a small house in a quiet town far from cities and spaceports. He tried to find peace, but peace was elusive. He had done what was necessary. He had saved billions of lives, but he would never forget the cost. He spent his retirement writing a history of the war, making sure that those who died were remembered not as statistics but as individuals with names, and stories and families who mourned them. Lieutenant Commander Maya Ortega was promoted to captain and given command of a new generation of warships. She continued to serve because she believed someone had to stand ready in case new threats emerged. She trained officers and passed on the hard lessons learned in blood. She never married and rarely smiled, but those who served under her knew they were in good hands. She was building the Navy that would protect the peace they had won so dearly. Sergeant Major Kyle Reeves received every medal the Alliance could give him, but he attended the ceremonies in silence. He stayed in the service not because he loved war, but because he did not know how to be anything else. He trained new Marines and tried to prepare them for the realities of combat. He was harder on them than any other instructor, but his graduates had the highest survival rates. He saved lives by being harsh in training, and they thanked him for it later. Dr. Lisa Grant dedicated her life to treating the psychological wounds of W.